The Pathway of Red Blood Cells, A Journey Through Pulmonary and Systemic Circulation, a presentation by Thomas Sellers for Anatomy 100. Now, the objective of this presentation is to understand the purpose, the function, structure, and organization of blood cells, and the circulations by which they are carried throughout our body. So the function of blood is to really transport and deliver essential elements like oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, hormones, as well as waste throughout our body. It also helps regulate body temperature and the pH level of our tissues, which actually averages between 7.35 and 7.45 on the pH scale. Blood also helps protect our body from infection and blood loss by carrying something called leukocytes, or white blood cells, antibodies, and platelets, which prevent excessive blood loss through blood clot formation. Now, this circulation is maintained by the constant contraction of our heart. And if this output is actually insufficient, or there's low blood pressure, tissues and cells become deprived of the oxygen and nutrients I was talking about, and waste accumulates, resulting in massive cell death. So you can really see why the heart, as well as blood and red blood cells, are essential to the health of the human body. Blood is actually organized. It's not 100% red blood cells. It's actually 55% of something called plasma, which is just a liquid ground substance made mostly of water. It's 44% red blood cells, so a little less than half, and we're going to call those erythrocytes. Those terms are interchangeable in this presentation. And then there's less than 1% of the buffy coats, which I mentioned before. Those are the platelets and the leukocytes. Specifically, red blood cells are what transport these respiratory gases, so oxygen and carbon dioxide. And this exchange occurs through the membrane, through diffusion. This occurs because of the shape. You call it a biconcave disc-like structure, which is just optimal for gas diffusion. And when I get into gas diffusion, I want to talk about something called hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin is what causes our blood to be red. It's a red pigmented protein in your red blood cell. And this is what's really responsible for the transportation of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And it happens because there's an iron ion inside of the protein that actually can have a binding affinity to oxygen. It's not a very strong bind, which really allows for quick exchange. And all of this occurs because of something called concentration, or oxygen concentration. So when you're in the lungs, there's a lot more oxygen, and the deoxygenated blood doesn't have any oxygen. So the differentiation between the concentrations will actually cause it to diffuse into the red blood cell, and when vice versa, so when the red blood cell reaches a cell that is low in oxygen, it will diffuse into that cell. Now I really want to get into the nit and grit of this presentation, which is the circulatory system, which is centered around the heart with blood vessels that really create the pathway for blood to travel around the body. And there's two distinct circulations that I want to talk about: pulmonary circulation as well as systemic circulation. One oxygenates the blood, and the other, respectively, carries this oxygenated blood throughout the body, deposits the oxygen, and then returns back to the heart to begin the process again. This slide kind of summarizes what we've talked about so far in terms of circulation, and it's a little bit of a prevamp to what we're going to be talking about in a second. So the organization of the heart is, it's about 4 different areas in the heart: the left atrium, the left ventricle, the right atrium, in the right ventricle. You can refer to this slide if you get a little bit confused later on in the presentation to kind of remember which is where, but other than that, I'm going to be discussing these different parts in later slides. So the heart is essentially constructed by 3 layers: the epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium. The epicardium is the outermost heart layer. It kind of allows branches of the coronary vessels to travel through the epicardium. The myocardium is the middle layer. It's the muscle. It's what we call cardiac muscle. And this is what really assists in the expulsion of the large amounts of blood and creates blood pressure. And then there's the endocardium, which lines the interior chambers of our heart, so the atriums and the ventricles that I was talking about. And it's really just a fibrous skeleton of heart that just supports and insulates it and creates blood pressure. Now I want to start with the pulmonary circuit. So this is responsible for transporting deoxygenated blood from the right side of the heart to the lungs, where carbon dioxide is released and oxygen is picked up and then transported back to the heart. So the first step is, of course, moving this deoxygenated blood through the heart. So this happens coming through the right atrium via the superior and inferior vena cava. It moves through the AV valve into our right ventricle and then flows from the right ventricle through our pulmonary valve and into the pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery splits into left and right pathways and carries blood to the lungs, of course, the left and right lung. This is where the gas exchange occurs inside the lungs. So these pulmonary arteries, the major almost highways, divide into smaller arterioles and then into something called a capillary. So capillaries share a membrane with alveoli, and that's those tiny air sacs in our lungs that fill up with oxygen, where gas exchange occurs between the carbon dioxide and the oxygen. So these oxygenated capillaries form venules and then pulmonary veins where blood is taken back to our heart. So now oxygenated blood is leaving our lungs through pulmonary veins, and it's returning into our left atrium and completing the pulmonary circuit. But now we have to take this oxygenated blood and move it to the cells of our body, all of the cells of our body. And this occurs through systemic circulation. So it's important to really differentiate between what we mean between arteries and veins. So arteries are what's carrying oxygen-rich blood from the heart throughout our body, and veins are responsible for returning this deoxygenated blood back to our heart. And this really begins at the heart, as I said before. So it's coming in from the left atrium. Oxygenated blood is pumped through the mitral valve into the left ventricle. It is then pumped through the aortic valve into the aorta and begins the red blood cell journey throughout the body. This aorta branches into into our major arteries and then kind of differentiates them between our upper body and our lower body. So the upper body valves, the upper body arteries service things like our head, our neck muscles, our arm muscles, and then there's coming off of something called the aortic arch, comes down the diaphragm into arteries that supply things like our legs, our pelvis, our perineum, and our midsection. So these main arteries are going to branch into smaller arteries and then arterioles and then capillaries, similar to the pulmonary system. So when blood reaches the cells, the waste and carbon from these cells are exchanged for the oxygen and nutrients in the blood, as discussed before, through diffusion. Now, once this exchange occurs, this deoxygenated blood has to return back to our heart. So the deoxygenated blood is going to continue through the capillaries and merge into venules and then veins. These veins all kind of merge into something called the vena cava, where it will be drained back into the right atrium of our heart. So from the right atrium, the pulmonary circulation will begin again, and the whole system starts over. One thing to note is that between pulmonary circulation, blood vessels are actually much longer in the systemic circulation because you really have to reach from head to toe in terms of how far the veins have to reach, whereas in the pulmonary system, it's just from the heart to the lungs and then back. So the vessels are much, much longer. So now we're going to go on and do a little bit of engagement. So one question I wanted to ask is, atherosclerosis is a disease where plaque builds up in the arteries. So now that we've learned about blood flow and red blood cells, how do you think this affects blood flow as well as the heart? And what are some possible side effects? The second question I want to ask is, knowing what you know now about the pulmonary and systemic circuits, why do you think that shortness of breath is such a common symptom in individuals suffering from myocardial infarction? And it's not supposed to be an infraction, it really is infarction, and that is, in common terms, a heart attack. So I hope you enjoy thinking about that, and thank you very much for listening.